Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I get to share the Spellbinders clubs for July 2026. First we have the Snuggly Knit embossing folder of the month. Then we have the Festive Greetings 3D embossing folder of the month. Next we have the clear stamp set as well as the coordinating dies to go with them. And that is called Cue the Merry. Lots of great sentiments for the holiday season. This is the stencil set of the month called Holiday Harmony. This one, it looks like a bunch of ornaments, and I think it would be fun for like a bouquet style background. We have the better press of the month called Festive Forest. Then we have the die of the month called So Much Fun. Absolutely adorable. Love those penguins. This is the stitching die of the month called Sweater Weather Friend. So cute as well. And then we have the large die of the month called Merry Shuffle. I'm going to be creating two cards with this one which is the tree and one with Santa as well. This is the Merry Bear. This is the All Clubs Crate bonus item of the month. Absolutely adorable again. And then we have the Candy Cane Swing. This is the All Clubs Crate exclusive item. This makes it super easy to create an interactive card that has some movement to it. The foil to go with the better press and foil of the month is the silver foil. And I'm going to start off with my Glimmer System foiling that press and foil plate of the month onto some Hammermill cardstock. I'm using that silver foil. I have my hot Glimmer System, put the plate with the pattern side up, the foil with the pretty side down, and then Hammermill cardstock on top with the plates on top. Press that timer button, and once that timer button stops blinking, I can put it through my die cutting machine to foil it. You need both the heat from the Glimmer System as well as the pressure from the die cutting machine in order to do hot foiling. I also foiled my sentiments exactly the same way, and once I'm done my foiling, I'm going to use a solid hot foil plate in order to use up the remaining foil and use it for the background for the Festive Forest plate. And for my solid hot foiled sentiments, I do die cut them, but I don't actually use them on any cards. The excess foil from around that die cutting, I'll use that as specialty cardstock when I'm doing die cutting and wanting to add some silver elements to my die cuts. So I keep doing my foiling. This is the first solid hot foiled background. So this is the excess foil from that Festive Forest initial foiling. Now we have the one from the sentiments. Now the one thing about the sentiments is there's a little bit of over foiling with my original sentiments, which is why I'm not using these ones, because they're imperfect. They're not exactly right. You can tell that there's a little bit of double foiling on them, but there's a lot of excess foil or excess around the outside of those sentiments that can easily be used up. Now, for correcting any double foiling or over foiling, I start out by using some Best Ever craft tape. I use the thick one. I put it on my shirt a couple times to remove some of the excess sticky, and then I just put it right over those foiled sentiments and it cleans them up. Even if I think a sentiment is perfect, I'll do this often just because it cleans it up a little bit. You'll see just a little bit more of a precise sentiment once that's done. The over foiling or the double foiling is on the T for the top sentiment there. So I'm just using a sand eraser to move that excess. Then I'm going to line up that die to go with this, and I'm going to die cut my sentiments, set them over to the side so that they're ready to go. I always tape my dies to my sentiments to make sure that they don't move on me while I'm doing that die cutting. Once I've done die cutting these sentiments, I'm also going to be using that press and foil plate in the better press system. I love the fact that press plates can be used in both the Glimmer system as well as the better press system. It gives them so many more uses, and you can use a number of different cardstocks or different inks. I'm going to heat emboss this pattern onto some Hammermill cardstock, and for the first one, I'm going to be using some Evergreen Bow Distress Glaze. The first two cards I'm going to be creating in this video are using this press plate, using them to create some super simple but elegant cards. One is foiled, one is using the better press system with that heat embossing. I'll also be using this press plate in a couple other cards as well, but just in a little bit of a different way, or just using some of my other backgrounds. So once I have my Versamark ink on my plate, I put the clear plate to the base, run it through my die cutting machine, pull off that cardstock, and then poured that Evergreen Bow Distress Glaze on there, tapped off the excess, and we're ready to heat emboss that. So I'm using my heat tool to melt that powder right onto that background. And you can see when it melts, you can see it goes from kind of a rough looking background to nice and smooth and glossy. I just love this color, especially for greenery for the holidays. It's such a pretty color. As soon as this first background is heat embossed, I'm going to set that over to the side to be used later. And then I'm going to grab a piece of waterfall cardstock and tape that to the clear plate on my Better Press system. For this one, I'm going to heat emboss it with silver embossing powder on that waterfall cardstock. So this is the great thing about that Better Press system is you can use all sorts of different inks, and I typically love doing heat embossing with them because the heat embossing has such a precise and great look to it, and it also adds that extra little bit of texture to the backgrounds. So I put some embossing powder tool on my cardstock, inked up that plate with Versamark ink, put the clear plate to the base and ran it through my die cutting machine. Now the embossing glaze doesn't come with superfine, but silver embossing powder does come in superfine, so I'm using that. When I do press plate images, I typically like to use superfine embossing powder when possible because I just find that you get more detail that way. If you ever do one with regular embossing powder and then one with super fine embossing powder and put them side by side, you'll see exactly what I mean. It's hard to see in a video what the difference would be, but you just get a nice, more precise look when you have super fine embossing powder available, especially for detailed images like this. So I'm using my embossing tool once again to melt that powder, and again you can see exactly when it melts. It just completely changes the look of it. I'll be using this background to create my first card, just a simple, very elegant card. I just love the look of that heat embossed silver on that waterfall cardstock. Now we're going to start by trimming some cardstock down. So I have a piece of hammer mill here that I'm trimming to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My pressed embossed background, I'm trimming that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And you can see I'll typically take some off of all 4 sides to make sure that all of our corners are square and everything is perfect. I'm going to ink blend around the outside edges with some Evergreen Bow Distress ink just to darken those edges and frame everything in. This is just takes it to the next level, and I love when we have backgrounds that have different color variations, some lights and darks to them, and I really love ink blending around the outside edges. Again, it frames everything in, and I think it just finishes it off. So I'm using a large Spellbinders blender brush for that. It makes it really, really easy to do. You can add as much or as little ink as you want. Then I have my piece of white cardstock here. I did clean my mat in between, and I'm using some silver ink from Lisa Horton Crafts to just rub that around the outside of that cardstock. I'll set that aside to dry. Again, cleaning my mat between each and every inking because I don't want to transfer ink and get something where I don't want it to go. I'm using an A2 card base here, gluing my mats and layers onto it, and then I'll just be adding a very, very simple sentiment. So like I said, super simple card, but I love the look and the texture that you get from that heat embossing, and by adding that ink blending around the outside edges, it just frames the whole thing in. It just creates a very simple but elegant card. Then I'm using my foiled backgrounds, both my regular foiled and solid hot foiled backgrounds. My solid hot foiled one is going to be used as a mat. I'm trimming that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches by taking 1/8 of an inch off of all 4 sides. Then I'm trimming my other piece down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches by taking 1/4 inch off each side. I'm using that same Evergreen Bow Distress ink to ink blend around the outside edges of that solid hot foil piece so that my greenery is actually that green color. And then I'm going to ink blend on my foiled piece. Now, rather than going all the way around the edges like I did for the last one, I wanted to create it a little bit different. So I'm just going to do it like an ombre look. So it's going to be white with silver foil at the top, and then the ink is going to get progressively darker as we go down the card, but still we'll see that beautiful silver foiling on it. Again, just creating a very simple but elegant looking card. Not every card needs to be complicated or have a lot of stuff to it. Sometimes the really simple ones are effective as well. So once again, I'm gluing these pieces onto an A2 card base. I'm using Barely Art glue to glue everything together. It just gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. And I have my glue in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for gluing things like this, but it also works great when it comes to gluing die cuts together because I can put as little or as much glue as I want. So again, this is very similar to the last card, very simple in design, but it has a different look to it because one of them has the foiling and one of them has the embossing with the Better Press system. Next, I'm going to be using the Festive Greetings embossing folder, and I'm going to emboss cranberry cardstock, and then I'm going to use that silver ink pad and I'm just going to rub it over the raised surface to color those letters. I want to be able to see those words a little bit better. So I'm being very, very gentle. This pad has a felt pad to it, so we don't want to press too hard, because if we press too hard, we're going to be putting the ink on the background, and I only want that ink on that raised surface. And that silver pad has such a beautiful shine to it, so we're going to have some beautiful silver letters on the top there. I also did a mat for this. So the mat was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I'm trimming my embossed background here to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I waited until that ink was dry, and then I'm going to use the clear stamp in the month to create a bunch of different sentiments. I haven't used this stamp before, so the very first thing I'm doing is using a white eraser on the stamping surface. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue, and this only needs to be done the first time you go to use it. Once it's done, you never need to do this again unless you're having problems with your stamp, but typically you don't need to do this step again. Then I use a soft brush in order to remove any of those eraser bits from in between all of those letters. I'm going to be stamping and heat embossing these sentiments onto some hammer mill cardstock. I'm going to do one set with silver embossing powder, and I'm going to do another set with that evergreen bow embossing powder. We're going to have way more sentiments here than we need for the cards that we're creating, but it doesn't take much more time to create a bunch of them than it does to create a few. And I always love having lots of selection when I'm creating, and I don't know which cards I'm going to be wanting to use the silver heat emboss sentiments and the evergreen bow heat emboss sentiments. So by doing them all, I have a lot of options ready to go. Any of those extra sentiments, I'm just going to put in a little Ziploc bag, put with this stamp set. Next time I go to use it, I may have some sentiments already done that are going to work for the project that I'm going to create. So it works great that way. I know that if I'm working with a certain set and I have extra sentiments, any of those sentiments are put right into that package, so I know exactly where to look for them. Once I've tapped off the excess powder, and if you happen to have any powder where you don't want it to go, just use the soft brush to brush that off. I'm using my heat tool to melt those sentiments, and then I'm going to be using the coordinating dies, lining them up, and then die cutting all of them. But before I die cut anything, I'm going to do that second set of sentiments. So we're repeating the exact same process, using that embossing powder tool on some hammer mill cardstock. Now we could use some colored cardstock here if we want, but again, I'm not sure which backgrounds I'm going to be putting this on, so I didn't want to use a colored cardstock that wasn't necessarily going to go with the card that I wanted that sentiment to go to. And with white cardstock, I can always take an ink and do ink blending on the background if I wanted to change the background color. So that makes it really easy to change that background color. If it's colored cardstock already, makes it a little bit harder. So once I have that stamped, I put that evergreen bow embossing glaze on there and heat emboss that. And once that's done, we're ready to do our die cutting. So we can lay our dies on our sentiments, and just like the Better Press sentiments, I like to use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape in order to tape those dies in place, make sure they don't move on me while I'm doing my die cutting. Now, if by chance you have a sentiment that's too close to another one and the die is going to overlap, we don't want to have our dies overlapping while we're doing our die cutting. That can get die cut in a second pass through the machine. If we have our dies overlapping, that is going to ruin them, so we don't want to do that at all. So once I have all of those matched, I die cut them. We have a ton of sentiments here ready to go. I did the same thing with the silver sentiments, put those over to the side, and now we're ready to put this card together. So I'm putting my mat as well as my embossed background on that background. And again, this is another super simple card, but because we have the texture from the embossing on the background with that silver ink on top of it, it just brings out all of those words. And then the sentiment I used was sending you all the merry or something like that, and I thought that worked well with all of the sentiments on this background here. So for the next card, I'm going to be using that stencil of the month. I'm going to be using this on some hammer mill cardstock again, doing it with, or ink blending it with some Distress ink. So first we have some Candied Apple. I wanted to do a bunch of different Christmas colors, and I'm going to start with the red, doing some areas that are lighter and some areas that are darker. I talk about this a lot when I'm doing stenciling. Personally, I like it when some areas are lighter, some areas are darker. If you want them all to be the same ink level, you absolutely can do that. But I just think it looks a little bit more interesting when we have some places darker, some places lighter. For the next layer, and these stencils are really handy because they have the 4 marks in the corner, so it makes it really easy to just line up those corner marks with the edges or the corners of our A2 size piece of cardstock. For the next layer here, I'm using some scattered straw. I wanted it to look a little bit like gold, but not actually be gold. For my last layer, I'm going to be using that silver ink pad, so that's going to have a lot of metallic shine to it, and I didn't want it to contrast with the the yellow with the gold. I didn't want to have the two metallics on there. So I kept it as yellow so it looks like it might be gold, but just not with all of that shine. This third layer here is using some peeled paint distress ink over, and you can see how quickly this all comes together. This is the back, or this stencil set I think would be fun to do like a bouquet style background. I know they're not as popular, or we don't see them as much as we used to a few years ago, but I think it could be fun to use it for creating one fairly easily. So this next layer here, I'm using that Silver Shine ink pad, and you can see how bold and shiny that silver is. It's absolutely gorgeous. I had to show it to the camera. You can see all the light reflecting in it. The last layer has a bunch of patterns for on those ornaments, and I'm going to do those patterns with some Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel. This is going to give it some extra dimension. It's also going to give it some sparkle on there. Now, when I'm using this Stickles glitter gel, I'm trying not to go outside my stencil lines. It's really hard to get off of that sticky mat if you let it dry there. So as soon as I get it on the layers of my stencil, I am going to be using a cloth and cleaning off my mat so that I don't have it drying on the mat. Another option here would be to put some printer paper or some scrap paper around the outside edges just to protect that mat a little bit. Then I'm going to let this dry, and I let it dry completely for probably a good hour. We want to make sure it's totally dry before we move on to the next step, and that's just trimming it down and creating a card with it. But this is going to add some extra texture to it. You could also easily use, like if you didn't have silver ink for the ornaments, you could even use some gel paste with some mica powders to color it to create some gold or silver gold or silver texture paste to add some dimension in metallic colors. And I also think you can buy texture paste in metallic colors. I just don't happen to have any. So once that's completely dry, we're trimming everything down. My mat is going to be 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My stenciled background here is going to be 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Now we could use that silver pad to do our background, our mat, but I thought doing it in the red would be we just frame it a little bit more. That silver is absolutely beautiful, but for some things it doesn't add a lot of color to it because obviously it is silver and not a bright bold color. So I thought for this one, using the Candied Apple Distress ink would be perfect for it. So we're going to glue that onto our background, and because that stenciled image is really busy, we don't need to add anything else to it other than a sentiment. So I'm going to glue that on there and then add our sentiment to it. So our first 4 cards really are pretty similar in design, as in we have our backgrounds and then we just have a very simple sentiment on it, and that sentiment's placing could easily change to wherever you want it to go, but because they're such interesting backgrounds, I didn't think it needed a whole lot. Now we're going to get into our die cut cards. So we have the So Much Fun die of the month here. I have it die cut out of Raven and classic white cardstock, as well as carrot cardstock for those orange accents. For the glitter on the hat, I have that die cut out of antique white glitter cardstock. This is just going to add a lot of texture, and I have a lot of different elements on my die cut cards that I use that antique white glitter cardstock. It's got a beautiful silver fleck to it, so it works perfectly with any of the silver accents that the cards have as well. Putting these dies or die cuts together is super easy. When you die cut these layered dies, they often put a little indent showing you where the under layers go. So it makes it really easy to place your glue and put the little tiny pieces on using that handy tool set, the wax tip tool from the handy tool set, or for the larger layers, just putting the larger layers down. When I have die cuts like these with lots of pieces, I will lay everything out on my surface, putting everything close to where it goes on the main die cut, just keeping it nice and organized. It makes it so that you can see that you have all of the pieces ready to go. You're not shuffling through a pile of die cuts trying to find the correct piece. And as you're going, obviously you're going to have less and less die cuts to pick up and choose from. So it just makes it really easy streamlining it. This is especially helpful, in my opinion, with someone that is new to die cutting and might be overwhelmed by it. It's nice to have everything organized, ready to go, and you can see where everything is supposed to go and have it all laid out while you put it together piece by piece. And by using liquid glue, it also gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy those things and those pieces in place, and also use as much or as little glue as you need for each piece. Now these guys here, this die set has 2 border dies to create hills for it. So I just die cut them out of white cardstock. You could also use that glitter cardstock for it if you wanted. I didn't opt for the glitter cardstock simply because I used the glitter cardstock for some snowflakes, and I didn't want the card to be overwhelming with glitter cardstock. So I'm using white cardstock, and then I'll be using a little bit of stickles on the edges of the hills just to give a little bit of sparkle to them, but they're going to be just mainly the white cardstock. Once we have our die cuts together, I'm using that Snuggly knit for the sky for the background. I'm using some windy cardstock, and I have it laid in my embossing folder crosswise so that we have that knit going across the sky. This is just going to give it some interesting texture to it. You don't necessarily have to emboss that background, but I thought it would make it look interesting to have that embossed texture on that sky. I'm going to add a little bit of ink blending around the edges just to frame it in a little. I'm using some Chipped Sapphire Distress ink, and again, just around the edges. I'm not even bothering with the bottom part of the card because that is going to be covered with those little snowy hills, so we're not even going to see it. And I'm doing it fairly light. I did a little bit over top of some of the other texture just to kind of darken that a little bit, have a little bit of color variation, but it was very, very subtle. So I didn't trim this down at all. I have this covering my whole card base. Then we're going to add those snowy hills. If you wanted, you could trim it down and mat it, but I wanted to have as much space as possible for the scene. And this is just such an adorable scene. I didn't really think it needed to have any framing at all. So once we have our hills down, I'm going to add our little penguins. Now there are some skis and ski poles in this set if you wanted one of your penguins skiing. I opted just to have them playing in the snow, but you could easily add that if you want. This set has that Let It Snow sentiment, and I just have it die cut out of regular white cardstock with the cranberry cardstock behind it. Then I'm going to glue down my snowflakes. These are die cut out of that glitter cardstock, and it die cuts beautifully. I never have a problem die cutting any of the glitter cardstock, and this is a pretty detailed die. If by chance you have a little bit of or your die doesn't go all the way through, flip it over so the blade is side up, the blade is up, and run it through your die cutting machine that way. Often around the outside edges have a little bit more pressure, but if you have it with the blade side up, the pressure on the machine is on the top, so you're going to have a little bit more pressure on the die side. It makes it a little bit easier. When I glued those snowflakes down, I also had a few going off of the edges just to make it look a little bit better. It always looks better when you have a pattern that goes off the edges rather than all within it. So once that was dry, I just trimmed off those excess pieces, put the little stickles on the edges of the hill, and here is our adorable penguin card. I just love those little penguins, and I love that texture that we get in the sky from that Snuggly knit. I'm going to set that aside to dry while I'm creating my next one, and I'm using that stitching die of the month, the Sweater Weather Friend. I'm using some white floss for this. It is just going to bring out the pattern, and for their scarf, it just does a striped pattern on it. For the sweater, it does little trees on there. So when I'm stitching on dies, I use a little piece of Best Ever craft tape in order to tape that floss in place. I don't have to worry about it pulling through. Then once I get to the end, I can use a little bit to secure that floss there as well. I have the die cut with my stitching detail die cut out of it, and I also have a solid die cut. These come in two different pieces. That stitching piece is an insert, so you could opt to do this whole thing without doing the stitching if you wanted, or you could opt to just use a gel pen and faux stitch if you wanted. I do like the extra texture we get from that stitching though. So now that we're done stitching this piece, I can use that piece of Best Ever craft tape in order to secure that floss. Then I can trim off the excess, and that solid piece that I die cut is going to get glued to the back of this. This is just going to make our assembly of our die cuts a little bit easier. That way we're going to have cardstock to cardstock rather than having the stitching, adding that dimension to the back side as well, making it more difficult to glue on there. I have some sewing clips here that I use for holding these two pieces together. That way I can set those aside. They can be drying while I'm working on my next piece. Now the great thing about stitching dies is when you do your die cutting, it leaves a little bit of an impression showing you where those stitch lines are intended to go. So there's very little guesswork to it. So it makes it really easy to do that stitching. Obviously you can get creative and do, like here I could say do a crisscross if I wanted rather than stripes. It does take a little bit of figuring it out, seeing if it would work first, but it's a fun way to just add that extra texture to your die cuts and something just a little bit different, because obviously not all die cuts are intended or meant to be stitched. So it's fun to have the odd one that is and add that little bit of detail to it. And I'm using white floss here because I didn't want to add any more colors, but I think silver or gold would be really, really pretty here. I don't have any silver left, or I don't have enough silver left in order to do all of this. So I didn't want to pull it out and run out of floss in the middle of my project. Now we have our scarf done. Our 2 scarf pieces are to the side drying, and we're ready to do our sweater. And I'm going to use that same white floss for this, using a little bit of that tape in order to secure it. Then we're just following the lines on our die cut in order to create those little trees. And there are 2 trees on top of each other. And it creates just this really adorable pattern on that sweater. Perfect for adding that extra dimension to holiday cards. So as I'm working on this, you can see that my pinky and my ring finger on my left hand kind of hold the floss taut. The one that I'm using is the Diamante white floss, so it has a little bit of stiffness to it, and I want to make sure that we don't have any excess floss loops on the front, and have I want to make sure that it's nice and taut. So I will use those fingers in order to make sure that they're nice and tight and that we don't have that extra floss there, and that everything looks great as we're going. You could also use a little bit of tape if you wanted, but those fingers weren't doing anything anyway, so we might as well have them working while we're creating. Once we have all of our trees done, we can add where we can secure that floss once again with that Best Ever Craft tape, and then we have that solid piece for the sweater that I'm just going to glue to the back of it. I'm going to do the rest of the stitching off screen here. So we're going to put that little bit of Best Ever Craft tape, and then we're going to secure that, cut off the excess of the floss, then put that back to the sweater. And again, this is just going to make it, you don't have to do this step, but this just makes it easier when we're assembling our die cuts. Because we have all of those die cut pieces there, it just makes it easier to have cardstock on the back that we're gluing to, as well as the fact that it's going to add that extra little bit of dimension. It's going to mean that we're going to have double thick cardstock there, and it's going to secure the floss right in between it. So once again, for my little deer here, I laid all of my pieces out ready to go, so that it makes it really easy to do the assembly. I can put the glue either on the die cut for the little teeny tiny pieces and then use my wax tip tool in order to lift those in place. Or for the larger die cuts, I can just put the glue onto the back of the piece and then lay it right onto my die cut. So once we have all of these pieces together, we're ready to add it to the front of our card. Now this one here has some adorable little lights to go on our antlers. So after we have our main piece done here, I'm going to put some glue onto each one of the dots for those lights and use that wax tip tool in order to lift those in place. It just makes it really easy for assembling those. And I have them die cut out of red cardstock, but I think they would also be fantastic cut out of some specialty cardstocks, metallic cardstocks, the silver solid hot foiled remainder pieces from my sentiments. That would be a great way to use them up here, just to add a little bit of metallic touch. I am going to add some dimension to the lights once our card is done. I'm going to add some glossy accents to them, so that's going to give them some domed glossy dimension. And the glossy accents, they look fabulous on regular cardstock, but it also looks really great on metallic cardstocks as well. It just takes that metallic shine and gives it some 3D dimension. For the arms for the deer, I have glue on one side to put the arm behind the shoulders, and then I have glue on the other side to put it in front of the sweater. So that way it's secured on both sides. There's also a little book in this die set that you could be having that deer hold if you want it to be hold, say like a songbook. That would fit right in between those areas as well. So the last step here is to add those lights to our little antlers. So I have, again, glue going on some places in the front of those antlers, some places in the back of the antlers. And with the glue being in or having a fine line to it, I can also just kind of press glue underneath the piece if I feel that it needs it. So for the background for this, I'm going to be using the Festive Greetings with some windy cardstock just to give the texture or some texture to that background. You could easily just have a solid background to this. You don't need to add the texture, but I really love the look of these backgrounds with that embossing on them. So once we have our piece embossed here, once again, we're going to add a little bit of chipped sapphire distress ink around the outside edges just to frame everything in. And not only does it frame it in, but it also really highlights the words around the outside edges. It kind of takes your focus on them. It's also going to frame in our little sweater weather friend as well. So for this one here, I'm going around all 4 edges. You can go in as far as you want, or you can leave it closer to the edges. I kind of made it a bit of an oval highlight towards the center. Once again, cleaning that mat off, and now we're ready to assemble our card. So again, I didn't trim this down. I wanted my embossed texture to go all the way outside to the edges. I kind of go in different moods where I trim everything down and have very similar mats on everything, or I kind of go all the way out to the edges. It just really depends on the cards that I'm creating and the mood and look that I'm going for. So once we have our embossed texture on our embossed piece on the background there, we can add our little sweater weather friend. And I want to be generous with the glue because we have that embossed texture. I want to make sure that we have a good amount of that adhesive going on to our raised edges of our embossed background. Then we can add our sentiment between his little hooves there, and then I'm going to add that glossy accents to the lights on top of him. I also add that glossy accents to his nose. If by chance you get any of those glossy accents that kind of run over the edge, just use a dye pick to clean it up, and you definitely want to clean that up while it is still wet. You can see that that glossy accents has a milky tone to it. Once it's dry, it's completely clear. So I set that aside to dry while I'm working on my next card. You'll see all of them with everything dry at the end of the video. For the next card here, I'm using the Merry Shuffle, the large die of the month. I'm actually doing the next 2 cards with this. This one here, I'm only using the tree. I thought it would be fun to do a card with just the tree. For the next one, I'm using the tree with Santa. There's also a little elf there that you could do as well. I opt to just use Santa with it. Now I wanted to add a little bit of texture to my tree die cuts. So I'm going to be using that press and foil plate, the Festive Forest press and foil plate, to add that texture to my die cuts here. So I'm using little pieces of that Best Ever craft tape in order to tape my die cut pieces within the area for my press plate. This way they're going to stick to my press plate or my clear plate, but I have it on the back of them so that I'm not blocking any of the front areas. I don't want to chance that I'm going to have some tape where I have the pressed image, or where the plate is going to press the image onto it. I'm using that peeled paint distress ink in order to ink my plate, and we're going to ink this texture onto those die cuts. I just thought it was appropriate to be doing a tree with this plate. Another option you could do if you wanted is use this plate without having any ink. You would just press that texture in there, and it has a really unique look to it. But I definitely wanted the texture to show up on the card, so I definitely wanted to add that ink to the plate for this particular one. Another option would be to add the ink and then heat emboss it if you wanted that embossed texture. However, for that, it might be easier to do that onto some cardstock first and then do the die cutting later, just to make it a little bit easier to handle. It's not impossible with die cuts, but it just might be easier with that, doing that before it's die cut. For my background, I have a piece of indigo cardstock here that I used the Festive Greetings embossing folder on, and I'm not doing any ink on that background. I'm just having that embossed raised texture to the background. It's going to be really, really subtle, but I thought it would add some interest to it. Because this card is going to be fairly simple, I wanted to add interest and texture in different ways. So we're having that embossed texture on the background. We have the press and foil plate image on the die cuts here, and I die cut them at a fern cardstock as well as rainforest cardstock for a little bit of color variation. You could also take these die cut pieces and add ink blending to them if you wanted to add some more visual dimension. For the lights for this, I die cut them a couple times, and I used some ruby mirror foil from the Ruby Treasured cardstock pack. This way we have that high contrast between the matte finish of the cardstock used on our trees and the shine from the lights on them. I'm also going to be using some glossy accents on those lights, and this is where the metallic cardstock with the glossy accents really show off. It adds that glossy dome dimension, but it almost makes the lights look like they're lit because it just, I don't know, it reflects the mirror cardstock in a really unique way, and it gives it such a cool, unique look to it. So I'm gluing those pieces onto the card background. Once they are dried, I'm going to snip off the ends or the little pieces from those little light strings. They go right off the edges of the card, so I wanted to snip them off before adding those glossy accents to them. I'm just using my detailed scissors to do that. We wanted to make sure that those strings looked like they were going around the tree rather than just going off into space, basically. Then we're going to add that glossy accents on each one of these lights. And you can see from the ones that don't have the glossy accents, how different they look to the ones that have the glossy accents on them. I don't even know how to describe what adding the glossy accents to it does, but it just has such a cool look to it. So once I have that on there, I'm going to set that aside to dry. Again, this card is really quite simple, but we've added a lot of texture between the embossing on the background, the press and foil plate texture on that tree, and then our glossy accents on top of the mirror cardstock for those lights. So I set that aside to dry, and we're ready here working on our Santa for our next card. For this card here, we're going to do the tree in the similar colors. I'm not using the press and foil plate on them to add the texture to it, but for the lights I used some silver glitter cardstock so that those lights are a little bit different from the ones that I did with the last card. The clothes for Santa are done out of cranberry cardstock. We have some white cardstock for some of the trim. We have the silver glitter cardstock for Santa's beard here. So we did a combination of white cardstock as well as the glitter cardstock. Again, not wanting to do too much glitter because it can get a little bit overwhelming. Some adds to cards in my opinion, but too much is just, in my opinion, too much. So I just did it for his beard. For the fur trim and everything, that is just done with white cardstock. I die cut Santa's friends out of Bellini cardstock, and then his cheeks and nose are die cut out of some blush cardstock. For the gloves as well as the boots, those are die cut out of Raven cardstock. Now, this die set has the possibility of making it interactive because there is the legs with the whole die cut out of the top. You could put it on a foam pop dots and have the legs swinging underneath. I'm not going to be making this one interactive. You'll see how that mechanism works for the last card for that candy cane swing. But if you wanted to make this interactive, it's really, really easy to do. You would just need a round foam pop dot to put in the middle of those legs when you're mounting it onto the card, and then the upper body of Santa would need to be mounted on foam pop dots as well. So this is the part that I'm talking about. So you could easily put that on a foam pop dot. It swings on that pop dot there. It makes it really easy to create an interactive card. I opted to just glue it flat on there because I didn't particularly want this one to have an interactive element to it, but I just wanted you to know that that is an option there. So once again, we're going to glue this to our card base. I didn't opt to do a different background with this one. We could use one of the embossing folders to add some texture to that background, but I wanted this one to be kind of a bit brighter than the last card. The last card, the colors were a lot darker, especially with that background. So this one I opted to do a light background to it. Now the last one I did the lights twice. I die cut each one of them twice, so we have a lot more lights on our tree. This one I just did the one die cutting of the light strings and one die cutting of the lights themselves. Because we have Santa on the card as well, I didn't think we need as much trimming on the tree. You could obviously do it twice and add more lights if you want it to be. And I am personally the type of person that has single colored lights on their tree. Too many lights for me is, or too many colors for me is overwhelming when it comes to a tree, and it's not my personal preference. But obviously you could easily add a bunch of different colored lights. If that is your cup of tea, you could easily do that, and I think that would be fun as well. So once again, we're adding a sentiment here, one of my stamped sentiments. Now I kept that background of the sentiment white so that it is subtle on the card, that we have the focal point of the tree and Santa. If you want it to be more noticeable, you can also just use some ink blending and ink blend around the background just to change that color. Once again, we're putting some glossy accents on the light. So this is glitter cardstock, so it's not going to have quite as much of a wow factor as the glossy accents on mirror cardstock, but it still looks absolutely beautiful having that glossy dome dimension over that glitter sparkle. So this is the finished card here. I'm going to set that to the side. And again, we'll see all of them dry in just a moment. This next card, I'm using that Mary Bear All Crates Club bonus item. I'm going to create a super simple card with this one, just with that adorable little bear. The bear itself is die cut out of fawn cardstock, and we have our bow cut out of cranberry cardstock. The tummy as well as the little muzzle are die cut out of some alabaster cardstock. I did a little bit of light ink blending with some vintage photo distressing. These pieces are really quite tiny, so there's not a lot of room to do a lot of ink blending, as well as the fact that my brush is so large, but I wanted to add just that little bit of color variation. Now, I haven't tried it yet, but based on the shapes, especially of the face of this bear, I think it might even be a cute little Care Bear. Like, I think you could adapt it with some color and create a little Care Bear with it. Obviously, it wouldn't be exactly the same, but I think it would be fun to try. Again, I haven't tried it yet, but while I was creating it, that's all I could think of. Now, often when I'm creating with animals, I love to use velvet cardstock. I opted not to do it here because sometimes I think I do that too much. So I left it with just some plain cardstock, but if you wanted to add some simple texture, using a velvet cardstock with this would be absolutely adorable, and it would add some fuzzy texture to that bear and have a really great look to it. So once again, we have all of our pieces here. We're adding some, I added some of them while it was on the sticky mat just because the pieces were there and stationary basically. Then I pulled them off and now we're just putting them together. The bear itself isn't super large, so you can see when I put it onto my background, it's quite tiny. I think it would be fun to pair him with other die cuts and say having something holding a bear, or having a bear say under the tree for the last card. I think that would be absolutely adorable as well. So I have them together. I'm going to sit them to the side, and I'm going to use a piece of waterfall cardstock, use that Snuggly knit embossing folder to emboss our background and give it that adorable texture. Once we have it embossed, I'm going to trim it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches and do some ink blending around the outside edges with that evergreen bow distress ink. So I'm going to do it around all 4 edges here. It's just going to bring out that embossing. Another option here would be to ink onto your embossing folder if you wanted to give it some more contrast with and really bring out that embossed texture to it. That's a technique that I do often, so I have a bunch of videos where I've done that. I did it in my last club's video. It's a great way to really bring out the, like, really show off the pattern for the embossing. But for this sweater and for this particular card, as well as the other cards that I've done in this video, I wanted them to be a little bit more subtle, so I opted not to do that in this one. But if you wanted to see that technique done, again, it's in my last club's video. I'm going to glue my little bear on the top portion of the card and add my sentiment to the bottom portion of the card. So super, super simple. And I do end up adding some stickles on top of that ribbon. I ended up doing it off screen while I was waiting for something to dry, so I didn't have it video recorded, but it's just going to add a little bit of extra texture to our little bear, giving that ribbon some, or that bow, some sparkle to it. So for my last card, I'm using the Candy Cane Swing die set. I have my candy cane here, die cut out of some Mirror Ruby cardstock from the Ruby Treasure cardstock pack. The stripes for the candy cane are the glitter cardstock from the Antique White glitter cardstock or treasured cardstock pack. Then I am putting together a little snowman, and I just have the snowman die cut out of white cardstock. I didn't want to have, again, too much glitter, and I like the contrast of having some areas with glitter and some areas with just white cardstock. I have everything laid out to go together really quickly and easily, and our little penguin, our little snowman here is just going to sit in that curve of our candy cane. You can also change him into a penguin, and there's also a different, like a tree thing that you can put on for a hat. So there's a few different options you could use if you want. On the top right of the screen, you can see pieces to create a bow, and that's going to go over top of the mechanism that makes our candy cane swing, so it's going to hide it. And then we also have some greenery that's going to go on top of that bow and decorate that as well. And I die cut those 2 different types of greens out of fern cardstock as well as rainforest cardstock, just so that there's a little bit of color variation and we can see the difference between each one of them. So I didn't lay out my bow pieces ahead of time to assemble, but they're really quite easy. Each one of the bow parts has 2 layers to it. They just get layered right on top of each other. I opted to keep them the same color of cardstock. You could easily change the colors and have a couple different reds if you wanted those different pieces to show off a little bit more or show up a little bit more. Because we have so much going on here with the candy cane, with the snowman that's going to be swinging on the candy cane and the greenery, I tried to keep it a little bit simple, but if you wanted, you could make it more complicated or have more contrast to it if you want. There is a large piece that goes in the center of that bow that's not really a knot to the bow, but it's a kind of a platform to put our greenery on. So, and again, also to hide the mechanism or the foam pop dot really for our swinging candy cane. So I glued the hanging sprigs down first, then I glued our little pieces of holly, and then we have the berries that go in the center. So I die cut our candy cane out of that Ruby Treasured cardstock pack, or Ruby Treasured mirrored cardstock, so it has a little bit of a curve to it, so I wanted to just straighten it out with my fingers just to make sure that it was kind of nice and flat before putting our card together. Then I glued the snowman behind it. I have some cranberry cardstock that I'm using for my mat for this, so that's trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And for this one, I'm using that heat embossed background done with that press and foil plate with that evergreen bow glaze. I'm opting to not do any more ink blending on that background, but you certainly could if you wanted to add a little bit more color or a little bit more contrast to the background, but I thought I would keep it fairly simple. So I glued that piece on there. I have my sentiment that I want to use, but once I put that candy cane on there, there's not really a great place for that sentiment to be seen, so I end up gluing it on the inside of the card. I didn't really want it covered by a die cut, and I didn't really want it to the right or to the left, so inside of the card, in my opinion, was the best place. So I have a little round foam pop dot. You want to make sure that that round foam pop dot is smaller than the inside circle there. It's going to be what that candy cane is swinging on. And I use 2 more on the top of the bow to hold those nice and raised. We don't want to put any foam pop dots on the lower areas because that can infringe on how wide or how much that candy cane can swing. So I opted to leave those just floating in the air. And I put a little bit of glossy accents on the holly berries just so that they would have some nice gloss to them. And you can see that that candy cane swings underneath there and just adds a really easy way to have an interactive element on our card. And that's the same type of mechanism that is on the large die of the month for the Santa as well as the elf. If you wanted them to have swinging legs on them, that's the same way that that would get created. Then we have our card using the Mary Bear All Clubs Crate bonus item. Just an absolutely adorable little bear. Again, a super simple card, but I just think that bear is so sweet. Then we have the 2 cards that we created using the large die of the month. This one here with the Santa, with the tree with the silver glitter ornaments. Next one with just the tree all on its own with those ornaments done with the Ruby Treasure cardstock, but you can see how adding the glossy accents really makes those ornaments come alive, and it really reflects the light when you tilt it into the light. Next we have our stitched sweater weather friend and the great texture that we get from that stitching as well as that embossed background and the glossy accents on the ornaments on his little antlers. And you'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. Then we have our adorable little penguin friends. So much fun. I just love the texture in the sky from that Snuggly knit sweater embossing folder, or Snuggly knit embossing folder. Then our stencil of the month with that beautiful ornament background. Perfect in really many different color palettes. Then we have our very simple but effective festive greetings embossed card with that silver ink there, and that silver ink has lots of beautiful shine to it. And our very first 2 cards using that press and foil plate. This one here is foiled, and we also have the solid hot foiled background used as the mat, and our little ombre inking on the front. And again, just because we have simple cards doesn't mean they're not absolutely beautiful. And then our first one with that silver embossing on that waterfall cardstock and that ink blending. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.